I think we'll kick off then. It's a couple of minutes past the half of the hour. It's great to see so many of you online, as much as I can see you, inverted commas. My name's Dominique Allwood. I'm Chief Medical Officer at UCL Partners, and I've got the pleasure of chairing this HOWN webinar today on creating collective impact, exploring approaches to anchor networks. So hopefully you're all on the webinar because you've got an interest in, or you're leading work in, or you want to find more out about how we can use anchor networks to really pursue this agenda of anchor institutions and having impact on health inequalities, local economy, and much more. So great to see so many people introducing themselves on the chat. Can I get the next slide, please? I am ably assisted by Sav and the team at HOWN. We have got a few little bits of housekeeping here, just to say, please can you stay muted unless we're in the kind of Q&A piece, in which case we might invite some people to come in on camera and off mic just to give their question verbally, but please feel free to use the chat throughout. We'll be keeping an active eye on that. So we hope the chat will be a real source of being an opportunity to share questions, share resources, etc. We're also using Twitter, and we'll be posting as we go, and I'll be trying to multitask. I'm sure Sav and the team will be. You can follow online at HOWN_UK. And Sav, I think I forgot to mention the hashtag, which is probably on the opening screen, so we might just need to flick back to that so that I remember what it was. Join the discussion at Health Anchors, so hashtag Health Anchors. Brilliant. Okay. We're also recording for YouTube, so this recording will go up onto the HOWN YouTube channel subsequently, so do make sure that you check that out, and you can share that around colleagues, friends, etc. Okay, I think I've done anything on the housekeeping. I'm going to just look to Sav to make sure. Sav, anything else I need to do to kick us off on the housekeeping before we get into the topic today?
No, I think that's perfect.
Perfect. All right, wonderful. So let's get into the meat. So we're here to talk about anchor networks. We've got some amazing speakers. We're really lucky to have Souraya, Conrad, and Eve, who are going to be talking about some of their experiences of leading, designing, setting up, delivering, managing lots of the work that comes out of networks. And they'll be giving some perspectives from London, Birmingham, and Leeds. As you can see, those are sort of big urban areas that they're covering with their networks. There will be lots of opportunities to discuss networks that sit into different areas of the country. I'm sure there'll be people on here trying to develop networks in rural and coastal areas as well. So we'll make sure we get chances to chat about that in the breakout rooms, because we'll be moving into some more regional conversations. But we're also going to talk about the role of networks in covering thematic areas of anchor institutions. So we'll make sure we get through that. We have just under an hour and a half, so we're going to hear from all of our panelists in quick succession after I've finished doing the intro. Then we'll have a little bit of time for question and answers with them, and then we'll move into some networking in the breakout rooms, which will give you a chance to have some much more in-depth conversations, particularly linking in with people from your local area if you want to. I often find that I have gone to events both online and in person and met people that are working just down the road from me on things that I didn't know about. So hopefully a chance for you to do some of the same if you're not already connected with people in your local. Okay, so we'll come to the panelists shortly, but I'm just going to say a few more words, I guess, about why we're in this topic and thinking really about anchors. So I'm sure many people on the line know lots about anchors, but for those who don't, a very quick 101. This term anchor institution has become popular within the NHS, particularly in England and across the UK, but lots of people have been working on this outside of healthcare and more broadly in health and beyond in our civic institutions and outside of the UK for quite a while now. And really anchor institutions are those big organisations that are rooted in their local community with that mission, really intertwined with communities, and really thinking about how we maximise impact through our employment practices, our procurement, the use of natural resources, estates, and very importantly, our partnerships. And so we're here thinking not just about at the individual institution levels what anchors are doing, but actually how do we get better now at working together in networks to do that? And the power of networks is really, really important, and being much more intentional about how we do those networks, set them up, design them and run them, I think is something on a lot of people's minds. We recognise that tackling some of these big challenges through the work we're doing with an anchor mindset is very challenging. It's large scale, complex change, and in order to do that, we can't simply do that one project, one program, one institution at a time. We need to be thinking about how we pull on the power of networks really to do that. And I guess networks play a really important role in driving change in healthcare. We need to think about having a common purpose, a way in which we do that connection. And there can be many different designs, from being very formally managed through to being quite informal and much more down the kind of community space, but really an opportunity for networks to share and spread good practice, potentially mobilize around a common purpose or agenda and do work together that really amplifies work much more than organisations can potentially do on their own. So we're going to hear lots more about the different types of networks that are out there from three fantastic speakers who've got lots of experience in that, but really thinking about the formal versus the informal, the different levels, the way in which they're run, the types of themes they focus on. Our speakers are speaking primarily from the perspective of thinking about in their regions what networks they've been delivering, but they will touch on thematic areas that they've also worked on, and we know there's many different ways in which we can think about networks, both regionally and geographically and thematically. So we'll get into that in some of the breakouts. Right, I think I'm about at time to be able to introduce our panellists. So in no particular order, but firstly, we're going to hear from Souraya Ali, who leads the London Anchors Network work. So Souraya, over to you, and I hope your slides will be coming up any moment now.
Thanks very much, Dom. So yeah, my name's Souraya Ali, and I head up the London Anchor Institutions Network team at City Hall in London on behalf of the Mayor. If we can move to the next slide, please. The London Anchor Institutions Network brings together some of London's biggest organisations, supported by the Mayor, to help tackle inequalities and address the growing urgency of the climate emergency. So we have organisations across the public, private, faith-based, education and cultural sectors, from the NHS and University of London through to Thames Water, Transport for London, all committed to using their workforce, their procurement and their estates management capacity to help build a greener, fairer and more prosperous city. That's the sort of the vision statement that we're working to. The network was established in March 2021 to support London's recovery from the pandemic, and it originated from something called the Recovery Board, which was co-chaired by the Mayor of London and Chair of London Councils, and brought together London government, business, blue light services and civil society to support London's response and recovery to COVID-19. But the network has endured beyond that immediate recovery period and evolved over time, and it's now very much about London's longer term resilience and how we can all work together to support that. So if we move to the next slide, please, I'll say a little bit about the structure. So we now report up to something called the London Partnership Board, which is the successor to the London Recovery Board and has a similar but expanded membership. But our most immediate governance tier is a steering committee, which is co-chaired by the Vice Chancellor of the University of London and the Executive Director for the NHS in London. And all of our members are represented directly or indirectly through a representative body on that steering committee. And that's really where decisions are made about what we focus on and how we proceed. And there's representation at a very senior level on that steering committee. And then our member organisations are all represented on different working groups. And some of those working groups are chaired by our members as well, to drive forward the different themes that I'll talk about in a moment. The network is supported by my team at City Hall, and we have also been fortunate to have pro bono support from Bloomberg Associates since the inception of the programme as well. So next slide, please. We have a number of focus areas that all contribute to those overarching goals I mentioned at the start around inequalities and the climate emergency. The first four that you can see on the slide all emerged from the London Recovery Programme and were based on priorities identified at the time, so back in March 2021, about the inequalities that were exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic, and that imperative for a green recovery in line with the Mayor's net zero by 2030 target. So they're around how our member institutions can use their own capacity, as I mentioned before, to make a positive difference. For example, in relation to getting more Londoners from underrepresented backgrounds into good work, but also helping them to progress so that ultimately they become representative of London's communities at all levels of their organisations. It's also about them using their procurement spend to support inclusive growth by buying more from local and diverse-led SMEs, improving the life chances of young people through mentoring, and then accelerating our drive to net zero through mechanisms like estate decarbonisation, but also greening last mile deliveries, freight servicing, and so on. All of these themes were revisited in December last year, based on what the data was telling us about the state of London, and members recommitted to them. And we also developed a new strand around childcare, which is specifically looking at how to tackle the barriers that this presents to primarily women's participation in the labour market. And this again emerged from looking at what the data was telling us about growing economic inactivity in London, partly driven by those with caring responsibilities, which chimed with the experience of our members in relation to their own workforces and challenges they were having recruiting and retaining women. So that's essentially, there was a question around how we generate our priorities and how we take those forward, and that's essentially a summary of that approach. If we move on, I wanted to give you a little spotlight onto one of these work strands, which is around our procurement work. So as I said, this is really about increasing the proportion of goods and services that our members buy with their own procurement budgets from London-based, diverse-owned, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. And essentially the way we approach this is we start by helping our members to understand their baseline, so what they spend already and with whom, and then set a realistic target for how to improve that. And that's no mean feat. Often the data is patchy. Understanding exactly how many SMEs they buy from, how many are in London, how many are diverse-led is quite a complex process. But once we have that and we set targets, then our members work together, guided by an action plan on how to increase that proportion of spend against the target that they've set. And that involves both individual actions that they take as institutions and collective ones. For example, we recently ran a Meet the Buyer event where several of our member institutions came together to meet face-to-face with SMEs in London and to highlight opportunities and how those businesses could access them. We then have a set of metrics that we track across this work strand and across our other work strands to understand how we're doing collectively. We aggregate those figures up. It's not about singling out any particular institution or naming and shaming anyone who isn't meeting their targets. It's about us having a collective sense of the progress that we're making. And we've been, with this work strand, working on both our members' own practices, but also how we can use the role of the Greater London Authority as a strategic authority and our economic development functions to also support more small businesses to become supplier ready. So that's a really important component of the work. If we move on, I'll just say a little bit about impact. So I said that we've been tracking a set of core metrics across the programme, and that's starting to give us some headline figures around how we're doing, some of which are up on the screen here. We're actually in the process of updating these numbers because we now ask our members to report twice a year, and we've just had the mid-year figures come in for the financial year. and we are working through those to update our numbers. I mean, the aggregate figures are all well and good, but I think what's more exciting is the snowball effect. And we're seeing how every time one member institution achieves a particular milestone, it inspires others to push further ahead. And I think that's one of the real powers of the network. And finally, if we just move on, I wanted to say a little bit about lessons learned. So we've identified, I guess, some critical success factors for making the network work up until this point. They're really around co-ownership. And so although, as I said, the network is supported here from City Hall by the Mayor, it's very much co-owned by its members. That's an important principle that's embedded throughout, with members chairing working groups, co-chairing the steering committee, and very much helping to set and drive our agenda. That healthy competition that I mentioned between members is really key, each one wanting to keep up with the pack. But when I say competition, there's a lot of peer-to-peer support, and that's really critical. People learning from each other's practice and very generously providing support to one another so that we can all move forward a bit faster. I think two other things I would draw out is storytelling. Those aggregate figures are helpful to an extent in understanding what we're achieving, but actually what's really powerful is being able to tell the story of how this work is having an impact on individual Londoners and London businesses. And we found that videos are a particularly powerful way of telling these stories in the voices of the people who've been affected. And we have those on the gallery of our website, and we produce new ones all the time because it really drives home the value and impact of all of this work. And finally, I would say the business case is key as well. So for this way of working to really be sustainable, it can't just be about the greater good for the region, as important as that is. It also is about how this way of working is institutions to address some of their own organisational challenges, whether that's, for example, seeing an improvement in retention rates from achieving London Living Wage accreditation, or whether that's seeing some of their operating costs come down through some of their net zero actions. Articulating and understanding that business case has proved really important as well. So we are starting a piece of work now to look at options for the future, again supported by Bloomberg Associates, because as the network continues to grow, we want to make sure that it's sustainable, that our work remains relevant. So watch this space, and I'll come back maybe in future and tell you how we've evolved to keep pace with the times. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Souraya. I think you may also have a slide that's got some contact details on it, so hopefully we can make sure that's shared. Thank you for a really clear presentation. Lots to discuss in there. I'm sure we'll get into the debate. If people have got questions, comments, reflections, a couple of reflections are already coming up, do pop those in the chat. We'll stack up all the questions for the end, where the speakers are going to create sort of mini. So wonderful. Do take a look at all of those bits and pieces if you are interested in finding out more. Clearly a great deal going on at a whole sort of citywide level. I'm sure people working at various different levels of ICS or ICB, through to regional, through to national, international, and sometimes within organisations thinking about networks, but lots to learn whatever scale you're working at. Let's go to Conrad next. We're really lucky to have Conrad Parke, who's going to talk about the work he's been leading in Birmingham.
Thank you very much. Just wait for my slides to come up.
Slides. I'm hopefully just going to flick through in a second.
Here we go. Yeah, so my name's Conrad Parke. I'm the coordinator of the Birmingham Anchor Network. Next slide, please. But I work for an organisation called CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategy, and an organisation that works nationally championing community wealth building, and within that, the role of anchor institutions. Next slide, please. But within that today, I'm going to be talking purely about the Birmingham network, the journey we've been on since 2018, the structure and how we operate, just as an example. But one of the things I'm really excited about with anchor networks is how adaptable they are to local circumstances and how they can operate so differently. Then I'm just going to give you some examples of our progress to date and then summarize with some lessons learned. Next slide, please. So this is the Birmingham network as it stands today. You'll see, sort of compared to Soraya's example of London, this looks a comparatively small network with just 6 institutions on board. This is quite deliberate because the network made a decision that this is about Birmingham as a whole learning how to be an anchor network economy. We felt we were best suited to do that by working with quite a small group at the heart of it, which could then expand as our understanding and practice grew. Next slide, please. So our journey started in 2018 with the Barratt Cadbury Trust funding CLES to explore the potential of an anchor network for Birmingham. That network was launched in 2019 with a local authority, a hospital trust, 2 universities and 2 housing associations. You'll see there West Midlands Police are marked out. They were an original member, but an interesting story is they had to withdraw from the group, not because of a lack of will or intent, but because as a regional organisation, they were really struggling to deliver special initiatives at a Birmingham level, which is what we were asking for. And so it just didn't fit with their way of working. They couldn't do special recruitment campaigns just for Birmingham, so they had to withdraw. Network was launched in 2019. They appointed myself in 2020. And I think one of the interesting things about the Birmingham network, we only actually signed our memorandum of understanding this year. I see a lot of networks who launch into things like memorandum of understanding quite quickly, but this network wanted to really get to grips with how this works and how it wanted to operate before committing to a full partnership. And I'm now very proud and very pleased to say they've committed to a further 10 years now, because they realise that's going to be the length of this journey. And the other thing to point out is within that network is a vast difference in scale. Birmingham University's Hospital Trust employs 20,000 people and spends £1.5 billion a year. They're literally 100 times bigger than Pioneer Housing, which employs about 200 people. And yet the strongest partnership within the network is the partnership between University Hospital Trust and Pioneer Housing. So I really advocate for having this range of organisations within a network. Next slide, please. So within Birmingham, perhaps a bit surprisingly, there wasn't an existing structure to hang the Birmingham network on. So it's been set up as a standalone structure with its own governance. A leadership group that meets once a year, leader of the council, chief exec, vice chancellor of the university, tuition group that meets bi-monthly that I report to, and they're effectively my steering group, which are senior people from with each partner, plus some other associate members who have become very useful in terms of delivery, such as the Chamber of Commerce. And then underneath the coordination group, we have working groups set up, not really thematically, but to really progress particular opportunities or challenges. And then this is all overseen by myself, a full-time coordinator, and my post is joint funded by all the network partners. They all put a bit of money in a hat and give that to Claire. And Claire employs me to work on the Birmingham network. The other thing about the network is we've never written a strategy. We've never written an action plan. We've always operated through learning by doing, starting small, letting that grow, and then let that develop into practice that could be shared across the network, if not across Birmingham. Next slide, please. A couple of examples of what this practice looked like. On employment, I believe we've been very successful. We now have the ICANN project, which in the last 18 months has helped 450 unemployed Birmingham residents redeploy into NHS jobs. And not only that, we can show within that programme a shift in NHS recruitment to some of the lowest paid, most disadvantaged communities in Birmingham, to engage some minority communities and to engage a far greater proportion of people with self-reported disabilities. The ICANN project is now later this month being launched as a social enterprise. which is going to effectively be an ethical recruitment agency for East Birmingham, not just recruiting into the Anchor Network partners, but helping East Birmingham residents also connect with other opportunities such as HS2 and into other organisations in Birmingham. And our next step is now we're working on apprenticeships and recruitment of young people out of school. To contrast this, our procurement work, if I'm honest, has been far less successful. I'm hoping Eve, in her presentation for Leeds, is going to tell you a better story on procurement. This has been a struggle to really get this moving, apart from one or two sort of isolated successes. But one of the things I'd like to bring to your attention is that there's a new public sector procurement bill going through Parliament that should become into practice this time next year. And so what we're focusing on is how we're going to interpret that procurement bill for Birmingham, with all the Anchor Network partners signing up to the same practice, because at the heart of the bill is a vision to spend more public sector money through small business. We think we'll do that more effectively if we all apply the bill in the same way. We're also doing a lot of work about land and assets. But again, going back to Soraya's presentation, a lot of this is about peer-to-peer support, because we've got some partners who are very good at driving social value down through construction supply chains. And so the other partners are learning from them. Now, quickly moving on, key lessons learned. Sign up is easy. What chief exec or leader in an institution would say, no, I don't want to support local jobs or local spend. So they all sign up. But the challenge is moving from that initial enthusiasm into action. And I would advocate for, rather than writing a strategy, identify a problem you can solve for an anchor institution. So on ICANN, we started with the NHS Trust that had a real challenge during COVID and lockdown with recruitment and retention of staff. That gave us the resource and the energy to move on that. We've learned lessons from it. That has now built up, and we're now working across the whole network with the ICANN methodology of neighbourhood-based recruitment. I also think Birmingham has benefited from keeping the Anchor Network separate to other structures. I've seen this in other areas where there's been an existing regeneration partnership or something, and they've just kind of made that the Anchor Network, and it's kind of dissipated the commitment and the practice as to what's happening. I think having a separate network has been really useful for Birmingham, because it's kept it small focus and I think interesting for the participants, this separate thing they're doing. But if I was to go back to the beginning again, or the biggest started this so much fun looking into the institutions to help them develop their internal practice in terms of spend and recruitment and contracting and things like that. And actually, I now spend more of my time looking outwards. It's about developing an anchor network
Oh, I'm wondering if we've lost Conrad. Sav, can you still hear him?
No, I've lost him too.
Oh, that's a shame. Let's give him just a moment to see if he comes back in. While we're waiting for Conrad to come in, hopefully he will be back to join us. Do keep your questions coming in. We've already got a couple lined up here that I'm going to look forward to putting towards the panel about different sized organisations, how to capture benefits, costs, etc. I was really interested in the benchmarking comments as well that Souraya made, so we'll make sure that we ask some of those from our panellists. Let's see if we can hear from Conrad. Conrad, are you back yet?
I don't think he is, no.
Okay, well, I know he was on his last slide, so we'll give him a chance to come back to his lessons learned at the end. If you don't mind just popping up his contact details, though, for people to get in touch anyway with Conrad, and we'll see if we can just come back to him for his final lessons when we do the panel. So this is Conrad's details about his work in Birmingham. Okay, let's move on to Eve. Hopefully we can get Eve on and hear from Eve around her work in Leeds and her slides, and then we'll take some questions for the panel. Eve, nice to see you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dom. So hello, everybody. My name's Eve Roodhouse. I'm Chief Officer for Culture and Economy at Leeds City Council. And really, I describe myself as the Programme Director for the Leeds Anchors Network, with our sort of sponsor for the Leeds Anchors Network being Peter Slee, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Leeds Beckett University. In my presentation, I'm just going to cover a number of things. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the strategic context in Leeds. Then I'm going to tell you about the network itself, how we measure progress and impact. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into some new areas of work that are emerging, and then share some reflections, which I may actually just add to based on what I've heard from the other two speakers. So if you could move me on 2 slides, please, Sophie, because there's a title slide and then, yeah, in one more. Brilliant, thank you. So in Leeds, we developed post the pandemic the Leeds Best City Ambition. Prior to the pandemic, we had something called the Best City Plan. But during the pandemic, as was described around London, we worked really closely together as one team Leeds, and it was the right time for us to develop our shared ambition. So the ambition is the overall vision for the future of the city, and at its heart is a mission to tackle poverty and inequality and improve the quality of life for everyone who calls Leeds home. And there are 3 key aspects to it. One is our working towards zero carbon. We did climate emergency in Leeds in 2019, and we were the first city to have a climate commission. The second is health and well-being, so tackling the health inequalities that we see in the city and improving the lives of the poorest the fastest. And the third is our inclusive growth strategy. Would you mind just popping the slide one more on for me? Thank you. So touching a little bit more on the inclusive growth strategy, which is really important context for our Anchors network. The inclusive growth strategy was in place for 5 years, from 2018 to 2023, and we've recently relaunched it with an update to reflect all of the change things that have happened in the economy, our commitment to net zero and so on, and a move towards 2030. It has 3 themes of people, place and productivity, and the Anchors network is really integral to our delivery of the inclusive growth strategy. Can you move me on? I think you'll need to go 2 slides from the title to the next. Yeah, brilliant. So a bit about the network itself. So our network was established in 2018, and that followed some work that was done in Leeds with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which showed that if anchor institutions could work to change their procurement habits, for example, they can make a significant impact on the economy. The network's grown over the years, and there are now 14 members of the network. So you can see that we have all of our major universities in that network, our 2 FE colleges, Leeds College of Building and Leeds City College, along with our major NHS organisations, Yorkshire Water, Northern Gas Networks, and even national organisations that have a major presence in Leeds, like the British Library. So as the network has evolved, it's extended to include organisations that don't just operate in our city, but operate elsewhere as well. If you can move me on 1 slide, please. Thank you. So together, the network employs over 59,000 people, and that includes nearly 2,000 apprentices. We spend about £720 million plus in the Leeds economy. That was FY 2021. And collectively, we reduced CO2 emissions in the city by 35,000 tonnes in 2021 compared to 1920. So we're working collectively together to make sure we understand these impacts and progress. Can you mind moving me on, please? We operate in a governance structure which is both kind of, I suppose it may appear really formal, but actually we don't have an MOU, and we don't have funded posts, which I'll come back to. The executive is chaired by Peter Slee, as I mentioned, from Leeds Beckett University, and each of the anchor institutions has a very senior member in that group. So it's either the chief executive or someone from the executive team, and that's really, really important, because without that very senior leadership commitment, you just don't get the leverage that you need. We then have a number of subgroups which focus on employment, procurement, climate and communications. And those subgroups are joined by specialists in those areas from those organisations. And they work on a range of areas that are of importance to the network as a whole. If you can just move me on, please. So in terms of how we measure progress and impact, if you want to move on to the next slide, what's really important is that the fundamental plank to the Leeds Anchors network is that each organisation commits to completing something called the progression framework and doing an internal review of how they perform against that progression framework, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. But then we also all commit to providing metrics and data, which is collated on an annual basis to be able to look at our collective progress. So there's both an individual assessment of progress and a commitment at a very senior level to move along, and a set of metrics. The third component is that we also have a shared business plan, and that's something we've had now for 3 years. So the business plan covers areas where we're working together, not just on the individual changes we want to make in our organisations. If you just moves on. So quickly on the progression framework, there are 5 areas in there which cover employment, procurement, environment and assets, service delivery, civic and community behaviours. So each organisation looks at each one of these aspects, and using the progression framework scores itself as to where it is on that progression framework. The organisation then decides how far it thinks it can move on that progression framework in the next year and sets out actions about how they're going to do that. There's no pressure on any or obligation on the organisations to publish the progression framework. It's kept confidentially by the organisations. We do compare things through the exec board, but we don't kind of mark people's homework. And I think, again, that's a really important thing that's worked really well for us, that organisations feel they can be really honest internally about where they are. We'd like to just move me on one more. On the metrics, there's a whole series of data collections. I noticed there's a question in the chat about how do we measure success. So we do collect data across procurement, spend, employees, apprenticeships, pay, health and wellbeing, and carbon emissions and savings. That means that we can benchmark, and yes, there are challenges with some of the data, I won't lie, and some of that also has developed and evolved over time. For example, in Leeds in particular, if you're looking at things like kind of head office location for businesses, if their head office is elsewhere, but they have a major office in Leeds, it's difficult to count how you're spending the money in the region, if that makes sense. So there are issues like that that crop up that you just have to make some good decisions about when you're looking at the data. But carry on, please. So a couple of case studies about our impact that comes through this. So similar to Birmingham, we've been really successful working in the NHS on different ways of employing people into jobs in the NHS. So where we've aligned our employment and skills service, for example, with recruitment teams in the NHS, and we've made sure that we've provided all the support we can for individuals to be able to get into work. One of the most successful developments of this over the recent years has been to actually completely flip the recruitment process and spend 12 weeks with staff going through, making sure that essentially they are ready to go into administrative roles into the NHS. Leeds Beckett have been the most successful on the procurement front in terms of moving the amount of spend locally, and they've gone even further and are using their teams to provide support to SMEs in their supply chain to help them develop as well. That's just moved me on, so I try and make sure I finish on time.
About 1 minute, Eve.
Thank you. So do you want to go on quickly again? So 2 quick areas of new pieces of work. So one, we've had a piece of work that's been funded through the Health Foundation, where we've been looking at how we can integrate these big anchor networks with local anchor networks. And we've been listening to people in those communities, and that work is now starting to influence new practice in the larger organisations. If you flip me on one more. Another area of work is the Leeds Business Anchors network that we're developing. So just a month ago, we launched the Anchors network for our major businesses. They also have a progression framework, but that progression framework has been tested with some of these organisations and adapted for businesses. So we're at the start of that journey, but we're really excited about how that is also going to come together with the overall Anchors network. Can you move me on quickly? Thank you. If you're going to keep moving on, thank you. So just to wrap up then, what's needed to make an anchor network work? So from our perspective in Leeds, it's that initial commitment from a small group of influential organisations, similar to the Birmingham story, with really strong relationships between the most senior leaders, ensuring that they're really committed to what you're trying to achieve in place. the willingness by those leaders to use their own organisational levers to deliver local benefit. So to build into their own strategy in their organisation this approach, and then to take action both inside the organisation, but to work together. I've got one more slide, which I'll just quickly pull some points out of on before I finish. I think there's some other key points which were reflected on by other speakers as well. So you need to design your network to fit the place, reflect the organisations and sectors and influence that you have in your area. Go with the energy, so focus on where you can think you can make the impact. So similar to what Conrad was saying, find something you can work on together where you can change the dial, move the dial quickly, get some real tangible impact, and then go from there, both in the organisation individually and collectively. Make sure you're combining that ambition with patience. This is a long-term game, so it's only now, you know, after sort of periods of working together over years, that there's an amazing level of trust between the organisations and that you learn from one another. And, you know, the final thing I would reflect on is that, you know, we're about to move into a new phase for our Anchors network. So we have never had a committed budget for our Anchors network. It's always been supported by edge of desk work and bits of money that were being put in. And the network themselves have now said they want to consider moving to a subscription model where we fund the work collectively. So that's something that we're actively looking at to make sure that we can move forwards together at pace. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Eve. There's your contact details. Really rich presentations from everyone, and you leave us on a really interesting piece of food for thought about resourcing this work. So thank you. Let's pop the slides down and we're going to kick into questions quickly. But before I do that, Conrad, you're back. I'm sorry you dropped off. So I'll give you the first word of a sort of 30-second, anything else you wanted to say about your sort of wrap up and lessons. And then there's a question specifically directed at you about how you sort of manage a network with a number of different types of sizes and types of organisations. So maybe I'll get you to think about that in your lessons as well.
Yeah, I don't know how that was at your end, but I seem to crash exactly as I hit my finishing word. So I'm hoping it was suitably dramatic and got people's attention. So no, there wasn't anything else to add. In terms of, so the question was about different size of organisations. Yeah, this has been very interesting because obviously it's the bigger institutions who've got the bigger economic assets. You know, a 10% shift in spend for the hospital trust means hundreds of millions of pounds for the local economy. 10% shift for Pioneer Housing means about a few extra £100,000. But Pioneer being a much smaller organisation, you know, they're probably only 5 levels deep from chief exec to frontline. So they can really respond and adapt quickly to try something new. Whereas obviously the hospital trust has massive levels of bureaucracy and governance. So it moves a lot slower. So we've just found there's been really willing partnerships between the small and the large because the small institutions want to bring the economic assets to where they're working. And the large institutions wants to have flexible, adaptable, nimble partners who can help them deliver. So I think it really works well.
That's great. You've had a positive experience. Keen to hear from Souraya and Eve. I think there's a bit of a focus here about some of the different cultures that exist, I guess, within different organisations in the public sector, but then also bringing in private sector, VCSE as well. So from both of you, how have you found some of those challenges and being able to overcome those within bringing these people together across sort of shared agendas? Souraya, should I come to you first?
Sure. So I think for us, that cross-industry nature of the network is both a strength and a challenge. It is a challenge because people are working to different regulatory regimes or different statutory regimes. For example, on the procurement work, it's much easier for our public sector organisations to work jointly on aspects of the action plan than it is for other members. But the strength of having that diversity of sector and diversity of size is that it brings challenge. It brings other perspectives. And so it wouldn't give up one for the other. It's something for us to manage, but we've seen really good sharing of practice from small to large and from large to small. And we've had really good challenge across from one sector to another. You know, that thing where it enables you to be a critical friend and ask a sort of stupid question about, but why do you actually do it that way? Because in our industry, we don't do it that way. And often it's not a stupid question. It's just, we do it that way because we always have done. And there is scope to change.
Thanks, Souraya. Eve, what about you? You've clearly got a huge diversity of groups. And then at the end, you talked about a business network that seems to then have a specific set of potentially focused organisations. So, yeah.
So to add to the richness of the conversation rather than sort of repeat some of the same things, we have been thinking for a long time about the larger businesses and how we should get them involved. And we decided we did a piece of listening exercise, and we decided that it wasn't the right thing to bring the businesses into the same forum as the other anchors initially. So hence we went about it where we kind of worked with the businesses to look at the progression framework and how it worked with them and bringing them along a journey. We've had several meetings with the kind of initial set of business anchors before we've had the first formal meeting. And they've completed that progression framework now and we'll be meeting in November. We don't yet know exactly how we're going to relate the two. We had a really good discussion about it at the Anchors Network when we met in September. So we know we want to, and we've got some ideas about how we're going to do that. But we're quite relaxed about the fact we're not sure yet, because we're going to let the Business Anchors Network evolve a little so those organisations build their confidence and can shape how they want to work together. And then look to bring the two together more closely on a range of areas. I suspect it may be on some of the topics like employer procurement, where you know, you can come together and be looking at areas of work. But we're quite relaxed about the fact we don't know exactly. Then the second question, which was about voluntary sector organisations. So the work that's been funded through the Health Foundation has been the primary area where we've been doing that. And I think it's really interesting because the issue that you come up against is you've got very large organisations like the University of Leeds, the Leeds Beckett University, ourselves, who want to sort of have an impact at community level. And then you've got really small organisations who are really working at that grassroots. And how do you kind of connect these two beasts, really? And the work that we've been doing through the Health Foundation has really helped us explore that, because the role that the smaller organisations have been having is being able to reach into those communities and find out by listening what it is that those people really want and need. And then that can be reflected back into the larger organisations to say, okay, so how then are we going to respond to that? So to give you a really specific example, Leeds Beckett University are using the feedback from the listening exercise that we've recently done to look at how they can change some of their recruitment practices to support some of the people that live in those communities to get into Leeds Beckett University jobs, because they know that their workforce doesn't reflect the community of the city at the moment. So that's how it's starting to work much better, where we're linking those really small community anchor organisations with the big beasts in the city as well.
Great reflections, and lots of people are really interested in that sort of diversity. Then I'm going to group a number of questions that have sort of come together around measurement, impact and ROI. So clearly there's a few things in that. There's one about how the individual institutions are doing that, and then how you might start to take an aggregated view across your network and how you're comparing like with like, or at some points potentially benchmarking different types of organizations. And then there's clearly the kind of measurement, evaluation, impact of actually your network work. And for people particularly like you, Eve, who've managed to secure resource based on that, you must have done quite a bit of evaluation to show the benefit that this network's having. So I guess we're thinking about measurement at different levels and for different purposes, but keen to hear all the panelists' sort of views on the work they've been doing and supporting that, any particular inspirations or challenges. From the organisation I work in, we've also recently published a toolkit, so I'll make a little shameless plug and pop that in the chat. But open to all the panel members to sort of talk about impact.
I'm happy to kick off.
You're being so polite. Go on, Souraya, why don't you jump in?
So that baselining activity that I mentioned in my presentation is something that each organisation does individually. So we have indicative targets that each work strand is working towards. So for example, on the procurement one, most of our organisations are generally aiming for 20% of their annual spend going to the types of businesses that I identified. But then each one sets a target in relation to that flows from their starting point, from their baseline. And they can, it's not so much about benchmarking against one another because they're all so different in scale and nature. It's more about understanding their own individual starting points. And then building up, you know, we've now been going for a couple of years, so we're being able to see longitudinally what the trend is, and whether the reality of what they're spending is then keeping up with the targets and improving year on year. Somebody asked a question in the chat about the business case. So essentially what we've done is we don't produce the business case for each individual organization. We help them to understand how the types of actions that we are collectively seeking to undertake as a network can help to address the types of business challenges that they are articulating, whether that's challenges around recruitment and retention, or whether that's challenges around a lack of innovation in their supply chain. And then we've had some really good peer-to-peer sharing of impact that members have found from changes that they've made, whether that's, for example, Thames Water's new or recent focus on employing young Black men and also prison leavers, and the positive impact they've seen on their workforce from those actions, or whether that's net zero actions that some of our members have taken. So they then share peer-to-peer what they have learned and what their data tells them, what their exit interviews tell them, what their recruitment figures tell them about the impact on their business from the types of changes that they've implemented.
Thanks, Souraya. Eve, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add, so we are also developing a playbook at the moment, which is funded through the money that we receive from the Health Foundation for this piece of work. So once that's published, that will have lots of information in there about the way we've developed the framework and the metrics, which people will be able to pick up and use in detail. So just to share that. And then the second thing is to say we have also done some interesting things where we've looked at putting data out in the open. So through our employment group, we developed a diversity dashboard, which I'll put the link to in the chat in a moment, because anyone can pick this up and put your data into it. The Open Innovations in Leeds, which used to be called the Open Data Institute, developed it so that you can put your data in and you can see if you represent the population of where you live. So, for example, Leeds City Council's workforce is actually very representative of our demographics. But if you drill into the data, you can see that the issue is that we don't have enough people at more senior levels in the organisation, and we also have our population, that our workforce isn't young enough. We don't have enough young people in our workforce, and so it's really helpful to go beyond things like gender. Diversity in your workforce to be able to do that and put it out there. So I'll put that in the chat. And I think as a network of networks, it's things like that where if one does it, then others can pick up some of that practice, that discussions like this are really helpful for.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Eve. Conrad, I'll bring you in just a moment. We're going to just take a last couple of bits of questions, but I'm keen to also hear from anyone on the call who's working in Scotland, Wales, etc., because I want to make sure we're not totally England focused. Anyone who's doing this work that might be in a slightly different setting, more rural or coastal, or at a different level, maybe you're at a bigger level, international, national, or ICB or ICS network, or something smaller. So if anyone wants to come in and just share reflections, please do before we go into the breakout rooms. But Conrad, I'll come to you about measurement and ROI as well.
Very quickly, because I think even Souraya covered a lot of the ground. But just to make the point that ultimately, I think what we're talking about is behaviour change, systems change. It's about these big institutions, not just seeing themselves as a health institution, but as an economic driver, not just seeing themselves as a higher education institution, but as an economic driver. And for that to happen, it needs to work all the way through an organisation. So even small budget holders are thinking, how do I spend locally? And I think to do that, I'll reinforce the point Souraya made in her presentation about storytelling. It's not just about collecting facts and figures. It is about collecting stories about how this is working, the successes, the excitement, and communicating that. So yeah, just to back up what even Souraya said, but just saying it's about using that then to drive behaviour change.
Thanks. Yeah, so important, the data plus narrative. And if we think about the communities we're working with, much of what we hear from them will come through some of that narrative. Such rich discussion. We could talk to you all day, I'm sure, and people have already written great feedback from the presentations. You've really given us some very granular details about the networks in a short space of time, even though I was quite strict on that timing. Let's just look to the chat just to see if anyone else has got anything else, or if anyone wants to pop their hand up and come in and just very quickly share a reflection from a slightly different perspective. As I said, something maybe that's rural or coastal, a different type of geography, or one of the developed nations. Paul, you've got your hand up. Why don't you come in?
Hi, yes, I'm Paul White from Ecological Solutions. I'm supporting the Integrated Care System Health and Inequalities Initiative and Population Health Management team from a VCSE informatics perspective. So looking at in the context of how do we reach all across Devon, and we include Plymouth and Torbay as unitary authority areas in that conversation piece. And a couple of things that sort of have emerged, I guess, is the connection to the local communities. You know, how do we get the voice of the VCSEs and the needs of the communities coming into the conversation, so that starts to influence the co-design of what we might want to do and achieve. And that's very macro. I mean, that's been mentioned on here. That's very low level. But one of the areas, I guess, that was a little bit of a challenge is just the procurement conversation. And one of the things that emerged very early on was the fact that the procurement processes were including a lot around net zero and the need for organisations responding to opportunities to demonstrate their credentials in terms of what they were doing. And that almost excluded a tremendous amount of the social enterprise and non-profit sector from the ability to respond, because they're not able to create the same capital and investment opportunities themselves to actually move towards compliance, certainly in the charitable and grant funding dependent parts of the so part of the conversation has been about how do we enable more social enterprise type activity where they can generate surplus revenue opportunities to then enable investment internally to go back into how they become greener in what they're doing, and therefore then more able to respond to procurement. So there's a very interesting conversation. I don't know if that's happened in the areas that have you know, that have spoken today, whether they've already had to pick up that sort of conversation and try to work out the nuances of how to move forward with the VCSE sector in that regard.
Thanks, Paul. Does anyone want to come in from the panel very specifically on that? And I'll bring one more reflection from either somebody in the audience or the panel. I've got I've got a couple of people with hands up. I can probably take those. Anyone on the panel want to say anything else? I might bring Andrew and Kate in because they might probably want to reflect on that. I know Andrew's been doing it this way. Perfect. Andrew, why don't you come in then, Kate, and then we'll finish off the panel.
Thanks. I had a particular reflection on London. I'm from a large NHS trust in East London. Is that I think London is really needs borough by borough buy-in to these things. Sorry about the rest of the country, but you've got places like Newham with about 300,000 people, Tower Hamlets not far away. And I think it's not a criticism at all. I really admire all the work that's happened at London level, but to make it meaningful, it's got to be borough by borough. The NHS sub-regions are entirely made up places, Northeast London, Central London, could be anywhere. Similarly, I think the local London and some of the other FE spaces, the GLE, are also kind of places that wouldn't be recognised. They're administrative areas. So I think it's, to make place work, it's got to be at the very minimum borough. Occasionally, there are boroughs next to each other that work well, like Camden, etc. I thought is from just a question to Souraya, really, what her thoughts were on that.
I just pick up back now for any closing reflections on these questions that we just did you want to come in?
Thanks. Yeah, it's sort of a relate. I suppose report about coastal and mentions anchors in it as one of the sort of solutions to the issues we've got on the coast with the economy and with employment. You know, anchor institutions, you know, public sector organisations in particular within that being quite a big proportion of the economy and the sort of wages that are going into an area. And yet you've got organisations that equally are quite challenged because of their recruitment issues. So you've got almost a double whammy. You've got more potential to benefit as an area, and yet perhaps you're not as well placed as, you know, Birmingham or London to try and do this. So it was just sort of I was throwing those ideas around in my head, really thinking, how does it square? And it seems like there might be something we need to do about maybe proportionately investing in this, you know, to get it more even.
Yeah, great. And we could have a whole webinar on any number of these, couldn't we? So thanks for the comments, and the panel are nodding. Listen, we're going to need to wrap this bit up. I'm sure more questions than answers, but lots of people in the room who are also very expert that we haven't yet heard from. Please do chip in the chat, because we'll make sure that your comments are visible too. If you've got answers to those or further questions, keep them coming in. But panel, anything sort of final from you and anything you just heard there, and then we'll move into the breakouts. No. Okay. Let's listen, let's get into the breakouts. Lots of big questions to carry on discussing. The way that the breakouts have been structured, there's going to be a sorry, I've gone on mute there. The way the breakouts have been structured is they're going to be around regions. So you'll have an opportunity to go to a region. Now, that can be the region that you're working in, but some of our speakers are going to be heading off into the regions that they are also working in. So if you've got more questions for those individual speakers, that can come out in that discussion. I'm sure that there will be topics that come out like the rural and coastal. There might be stuff about the VCSE and other bits that were coming up in those questions and comments through the regional conversations. But if you feel like you want to have a more general or thematic conversation, then stay in the big room, because I'll try and field a small number of us to have some slightly more less geographically based conversations, but hopefully you'll be able to get to your regions and meet other people. You'll also get a chance to dip in and out of the regions and go meet people in other regions. So we're really hoping you'll use the breakouts well. So welcome back. We've managed to keep quite a big number of us with us, so thank you. We're on the home straight the last 10 minutes. We had about 15 breakouts, and I convened a small international conversation in the main room, which was fantastic. We've got some people who want to give a bit of feedback, and great to see some hands up. So let's get to Babs first and then Conrad. I'm looking for a few facilitators to share some reflections. So Babs, why don't you go first?
I facilitated the Wales breakout room, which didn't have everybody from Wales in it because some of you went off to find out things elsewhere. But I think one of our reflections was really around, we've got a lot of strategy in Wales. We've got a lot of legislation that really helps anchor work. And we are probably doing quite a lot of anchor work, we were reflecting, that we don't describe as anchor work. And we're wondering how we can best really understand what we are doing, and why sometimes that strategy isn't making its way into the implementation space, and what networks we've already got really that we can work with, like the public sector boards we have here, which is working around local council areas, wider membership, how we can use those to improve the impact that we're having. I was there with two other people. If they want to jump in, that's fine, but that was my reflection on what we said.
Wonderful, thanks Babs. And it seems like lots of great conversation there. Hopefully some things for you guys to take forward, probably people that are known to each other, but hopefully some opportunities to continue connecting and driving some further action as a result of that. So great to hear from you. I think Conrad was next, and then I'll take Neil, and I've got a few other hands up, which is great. So Conrad, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, very quickly. Midlands interesting one about geography and how everybody seems to be working at different geographies: borough, local authority, region, sub-region. And we didn't come to an answer, obviously, but it's just reflect on, actually, anchor networks is a very flexible tool. You know, it doesn't have to be a local authority. You could build a network around a little or around a collection of boroughs. And yes, and it was just that I think some people were struggling or were challenged by the geography of the network they were trying
Yeah,
to.
it's a great point. This diversity of scale, and I mean, you can even have a network within an organisation trying to network all the people doing anchor work, but you'd hope they maybe can coalesce around something that's more in their traditional programmatic structures. But yeah, we've seen anchor networks of all sorts of scales and sizes, and really interesting to think about what does that mean for the way in which you manage, lead it, support it. We've heard from some great examples here today that they've had some fantastic resource to support the setup of the network, but particularly as you get bigger, those things need a lot of thought. So thank you, Conrad. Let's go to Neil, then Simon.
So I chaired the session in the Northwest. That was really good. New people who hadn't met, so really good networking, finding out what's going on in Morecambe and in Salford. We talked about the challenges if you're not in a city, which is quite interesting because you've got, you know, different challenges, not having a sort of single focus. I guess the main bit I wanted to feedback was we sort of picked up on the, you know, the people who spoke this morning all seem to have the same subgroups and working groups as you'd expect, but there's probably not any sharing going on across those subgroups, and that would be something to really be interesting to have a look at, how we can share more, you know, for, you know, on that. And I think also, you know, there's so much going on and so many people doing things, and we don't really know always in the Northwest, in Greater Manchester and Lancashire, who is doing what, and we probably need a better way of trying to sort of identify, you know, what is going on and who is leading on things and how we can join up those dots.
Great point. You know, the key purpose of networks being about sharing and learning, but we can sometimes inadvertently with networks or working groups that start to divide people into more common areas. So how do we make sure we keep that fluid and share and learn? Wonderful. Let's go to Simon and we'll finish off with Sarah before we do a very quick evaluation.
Thanks, Dom. So I was sort of facilitating the Southwest group. We had a Dorset, Devon contingent, myself and Rupert. Just an overview of developing Dorset work and the challenges we're facing. We launched a charter far too early, actually, and listening to Conrad, and there's a learning there. And Devon was interesting because there were 4 people in the room, all sort of working on different initiatives, some integrated, some at sort of ICS level and steering group level, others such as Ian's food project in Plymouth, which really exemplified something we all are going to take as a takeaway. I think Conrad's comment about learning by doing and start small, because otherwise an anchor network can be so nebulous, and especially when you're starting to get going, and particularly maybe for a rural coastal areas or geography such as Devon and Dorset, where we might not have the same kind of intensive structures and infrastructures as some of the big cities. So like that one, we're all signed up to learn by doing, do something, make it tangible, proof of concept, bring others with you, I think is the learning there. Thanks, Dom.
Thanks, Simon. Sarah, let's hear from you.
Yeah, three very quick points I'll pull out from the East of England session. It feels a bit like Eurovision, doesn't it? These are the points from the East of England panel. One was about language, and some of us are using the term social impact as opposed to anchors, and whether different language helps partners and others understand what it is we're trying to come together to do. The second point was about our regional footprint. So aside from Essex, there is no network grouping so far in East of England, and I think there was a general feeling that people would welcome the opportunity to continue to build on some of these conversations and complement each other rather than compete with each other in some areas. And thirdly, really interestingly, Jennifer told us about the fact that universities across East of England have received specific funding as part of an ICS programme. So there's an opportunity for all of us to tap into that. So there'll be further conversations that have been shared. So really
great. Love that new contacts, new opportunities being shared across a number of different regions. Some regions obviously a bit big and disparate people together, but some have really found some interesting common stuff there. Albert, we'll come to you last because I didn't see your hand up. I'm sorry. And in the meantime, Savannah's going to help just pop a poll up for an evaluation at the same time. So if people drift off, please do answer and put some comments in the chat about anything you'd like to see more of, less of, differently next time. But Alba, final word to you, I think, in terms of your feedback from the Scotland group.
Thank you. Yes, in case people were wondering, I was facilitating the Scotland's breakout room, but we were a very, very small group. So we decided that participants would join the other breakout room. So I do not have any highlights from my room to mention. That's it.
Well, listen, if we run this again, hopefully we're going to get a bigger contingent outside of England. So good to know. So thank you, Alba. Thanks so much to all the panelists, everyone that was facilitating rooms, everyone that joined and stayed on and contributed. It was such a fascinating conversation, so much food for thought. I've definitely learned some things. Some really great feedback in the poll. If anyone would want to pop additional comments just to qualify what they're saying about what they found useful and interesting, I'm sure our speakers would love to hear, our facilitators would love to hear. And if you want to share contact details or any further resources, please do so. So Savannah, it's just final bits from me, isn't it, to say ensure you're signed up to the newsletter for the Hound. A recording of this with the output from this conversation and slides will be shared via that newsletter. Please go to hound.org.uk to find lots of free resources and blogs, and they are really fantastic, and it's all freely available for people. Please make sure you do join the conversation, share any final reflections, and bring other people in via social media, either LinkedIn or Twitter on hound_UK or hashtag Health Anchors. And thank you so much to the Hound team for putting this on. And brilliant. Yeah, please do make sure that you keep in touch with us via all sorts of media and channels.